Hi there and welcome. My name is Derek Feldman and I'm excited to be with you today as we share Wave 2 trends from the Millennial Impact Report. This year's report focuses on politics and cause engagement with millennials. For the next hour, we're going to be together talking about not only what we've seen so far, how that impacts what we've seen from Wave 1, which we reported out in June at MCon, but where we see some additional new questions that are coming up since we started this study earlier this part of the year. So as we go through today's discussion together, we're going to be opening it up towards the end for questions about some of the data that we'll share with you today. So around 45 minutes into the webinar, we will actually answer any questions, myself, Dr. Amy Thayer, who is joining me today, and will be available to you to answer any questions that you may have. So feel free to put those questions into your questions box section here on your GoToWebinar control panel. We are recording this session, and of course you can have a copy of the presentation, and yesterday morning we debuted the report, which are all available at millennialimpact.com. We'll also share at the end that email or that web address so that you have that for future reference too. We have to thank our sponsor, the Case Foundation. They have been partnering with us since around 2009 to help the field really understand how and why millennials engage with causes. What's been really great about our partnership with the Case Foundation is that they've been committed to working and helping nonprofits like yourselves, government organizations, companies, corporations, and other entrepreneurs to try and understand how to engage this very socially activism style demographic. So thank you so much to the Case Foundation for their continued support of the Millennial Impact Project. We want to begin now as an overview of what is the Millennial Impact Project. As I mentioned, the Case Foundation has been supportive of the project since 2009. The Millennial Impact Project started in 2009. We've had more than 75,000 participants in our studies. And that includes studies that we've also done around things like millennial running, and in addition to other studies such as the Millennial Alumni Studies with the Chronicle of Philanthropy. The goal of the project, as I mentioned, is to help understand how the millennial demographic that was born between 1980 and 2000 are involving with causes. Each year we debut at MCon and several other points throughout the year, new research that we are doing and conducting in partnership with others, of course, and we make that all available at the millennialimpactproject.com. And in the coming years, we'll be debuting additional research around social issues, as well as looking at 2018 as we begin to think forward as we look back to the last 10 years of the Millennial Impact Project and what's been the most notable features. For those of you who are not aware of all of the research at the Millennial Impact Project, you may want to head to one of the key documents that we have there, which is the 100 most intriguing or best findings that are from the Millennial Impact Project. You can download that at the millennialimpactproject.com. So why do this study? This was obviously an unprecedented year, right? You probably have heard that many times. You even said it yourselves as well. It was hard to ignore or hard to look at cause engagement this year without actually having some sort of connection or relationship to politics. And given this year, and although we've done studies in similar election years, 2012, of course, and we started the Millennial Impact Project in 2008, but not in time for that election, we felt that it was important that we cover this topic. And there were some specific questions that we wanted to know. Is that how does millennial cause engagement really change? And that cause engagement is defined by everything from giving and volunteerism to their activism to their support of social issues. Do the candidates dissuade them to engage in certain activities? We wanted to know whether or not there are any factors within the political election or political piece that has sort of changed this engagement. Are there any correlations there? And then, of course, what if any demographic factors are connected to those trends too as well? And then lastly, understanding the motivation to donate their time and their money specifically during this year. And as we go through the Wave 2 findings, as Dr. Amy Thayer will talk about the ways in which the study was designed, our premise and our overall goal is to look at how this election in and of itself can either spark or enhance detract at times the way in which that people, especially millennials, involve themselves with social issues. Now, we know that long-term studies are needed to determine that, but this, of course, will help us get a snapshot this year of what's really happening for us to look in concert with other millennial impact studies that we've performed in the past. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Amy Thayer, who's our head of research here at Achieve and had led the methodology and has been leading this study. So Dr. Thayer.
Thank you. So as Derek discussed, this is wave 2 data, and so as we go through the presentation, the findings and trends that we present here are reflective of data that were collected in June, July, and August. And as you can see, 350 unique respondents were surveyed each month, and then that brings us to a total of 1,050 respondents for a total of wave 2. So this graphic just depicts the overall methodology of the study and how it was created. And so as you can see, wave 2 with 1,050, they're unique and unrepeated respondents, meaning that each respondent has only taken the survey one time. And as you see, wave 2 is situated within a larger design for the study with wave 1, which we've already discussed in the past, which was released in June. And then subsequent to wave 2 is wave 3. And we're just now in the midst of wave 3 data collection. Following wave 3 survey collection, immediately after the November 8th election, we will survey a group of 350 individuals who had been surveyed previously in either wave 1, wave 2, or wave 3. And that will just give us a very quick, immediate survey response data focused on how they voted during the election, for whom they voted during the election, and how that corresponds with their different cause-related engagement activities. And then subsequent to that November election, data collection will have phase 2 of the study, which is focused on qualitative methods, where we'll be able to interview folks who participated in the surveys previously to get at either validating some of the survey results that we found over the last year, and also to expound a bit on certain areas that may be needed to delve a bit more deeply to gather understanding as to the why instead of just the what.
Yeah, one of the key things I think, Dr. Thayer, as we went through this is in doing this study in different waves, it allows us to look at questions that still need to be answered. And because there's so many times as we do our own studies and others, you're like, well, why did that happen or what's going on? And so really that qualitative phase is really important for that.
Agreed. And I think by collecting data in different ways, we're able to see trends and findings, which we'll go over in just a bit, that have remained constant and how they have changed as well, and try to understand why those changes have occurred or why they have remained the same.
Yeah.
Agreed. So as we look at the survey, the sample demographics for this wave 2 survey, you can see it's pretty evenly split between male and female. We have different age groups representing 3 distinct groups of millennials. And so in the report, there are certain findings where they are different between the different age groups, and so we highlight those where appropriate. And additionally, the racial background is predominantly white, but we do have large groups of Black, African American, as well as Latinos represented in the study. So we tried to put together a sample that was reflective of the overall millennial population.
All right, so as we mentioned earlier, we had wave 1 and we reported that in June. And when that report came out in June, we had a total of, I believe, 8 or 9 trends that came out during that time. These were trends that we were watching. They were noticeable during that time. And what we did in wave 2 is to look at those same trends and see whether or not they're still trends, and whether new trends had surfaced in the second wave. And so in this section, what we want to do is review each of the trend areas from both wave 1, and then look at some new trends that came out in wave 2. So Dr. Amy Thayer, please bring us through some of the key trends from this.
Yeah, so looking at trend 1, we saw from the data that supporters of Hillary Clinton actually increased from June to August, but so did millennials that chose neither candidate or indicated that they would not be voting at all. And so as you look at across wave 1 and even into wave 2, March and April, you see no voters, folks who are not going to vote for either candidate at 5%. And as we move through the end of wave 1 and into wave 2, it bumps up a little bit to 10%. And then by August, we are seeing 16% of folks indicated that they were not going to vote for either major party candidate. Additionally, as you look at the folks planning not to vote, in March it was at 5% and to steadily increase until we got to August at 10%. And so this really does seem representative of the overall findings that we're finding with voters this election season. As the candidates change and as the debates go on, we see how folks are changing who they want to vote for and whether or not they want to vote at all. So this led us to some questions, and that's one thing that we're doing with each report is once we look at trends from wave one, that we get the data from wave two, and we're collecting questions as we go along to really investigate, maybe at the qualitative portion, but to also inform the way in which we look at the data as it emerges. And so we want to understand, well, the groups of folks planning to vote for neither candidate or folks planning not to vote at all, will those continue to increase at the same rate or will it increase faster as we go along? Additionally, we want to understand if millennials have been sort of rubbed the wrong way, if you will, by the candidates or some of the things that they stand for, is that going to affect voter turnout in the future? So trend 2 and trend 4 we actually put together so that we can have a more comprehensive look at how folks identify themselves and how that may have changed over time.
And these were, just so that you know, this is from wave 1, trend 2, and trend 4. And we're looking at those in combination now.
Yes, and so as we found, more millennials continue to self-identify as conservative-leaning rather than liberal-leaning, but then the gap is continuing to widen those who self-identify as neutral. And so when we look from wave 1 to wave 2, we see that the conservative-leaning folks, and those are folks, these are self-identified. So we didn't ask if they were conservative, we just asked in which way they were tending to lean. And so 50% in wave 1 as well as 50% in wave 2, so no change there. And then when you look at the liberal-leaning folks, a slight decrease from wave 1 to wave 2, just by about 2%. But then when you look at the neutral or other, it was 7% in wave 1, that's increased to 9% in wave 2. And so we'll continue to keep an eye on that as we move through into wave 3 data. And so the questions that we want to ask, really looking at wave 2 and looking how folks and how they identify politically, ideologically, we want to understand if, the percentages of millennials self-identifying as neutral will continue to grow. What will be the ideologies that millennials tend to most align themselves with, and how will this change or remain the same as we go along?
Our next trend is trend 3. So I'll be covering the remainder of the trends as we go through here, and then we'll open it up for questions. I see many of you already have the questions that are coming in. In this one, we're looking at education and healthcare as it remained the first and second highest social issues of interest for millennials, but employment wages edged out the economy as the third and highest interest area. As we were going through this study, a common question that we get every year from individuals is, tell us specifically, what kind of social issues do millennials care about? What are the kinds of areas in which that they want to address from their activism, from their giving, and their volunteerism? So each year we try to address that through many different outlets. And this year, as we saw, we were even able to break it down by candidate or whether or not they planned to vote or answered none in that category too. As you can see here, education and human rights. You might be wondering, well, why was Bernie Sanders in this piece? Because during wave 2, we captured data into the 3 months leading from June, July, and August, which was right before the conventions, of course. And so that was around the time when he was kind of dropping out, but we still had data from them. And so when you look at this in the categories, you can kind of see some interesting pieces that correlate here. One being that human rights are very, very high with Bernie Sanders, education, and the environment. We see that happening in terms of Hillary Clinton, where it's more education, healthcare, and then employment and wages. What I want to point out is the I do not plan on voting scenario there, which is around employment, healthcare, and arts and culture areas. So what does this mean? Obviously, we're going to have to get to some clear definition on social issues. We had discovered both in wave 1 and wave 2 that, as we mentioned earlier, this education, healthcare kind of piece is very dominant. And that based upon potentially public discussion and discourse around that time, some of these may or may not be selected because of what's happening. Obviously, in this next wave that we'll be recording all of the data, that is when the debates actually happened. And so there were also some things that happened in the campaigns on both sides, including charitable as well as other kinds of personal pieces that are coming out on the candidates And so that in this third wave of data that's been currently collected over the last 2 to 3 months, we'll be able to look at how whether or not any of those personal and or charitable pieces or any other conversations and discourse around those publicly shifted or changes the social interest areas of the participant pool. So this opened up some clear questions for us, is that are these within, what specific areas of interest are in these overarching social issues? And if somebody will come to us and say, well, Derek, what does it mean when they want to help the economy? Well, that's something that we'll be diving deeper into as we go forward into the study, including into the qualitative measures. Looking at, well, is it education or is it and economy or is it debt? Kind of getting specific into those areas, something that we'll be asking then. How might we see these social issues of interest change? And we want to know whether or not these will actually change when it comes to the perspective of what happens in the actual campaign itself, what is known about the candidate during the time, where the media is having those conversations and driving it, as well as their performance in the debates, all collected in Wave 3. So we'll be looking at that specifically over the next 3 months. What's interesting about the way in which we constructed this study is that we constructed it in a way that said we're going to continue this iterative process of learning along the way, right? So what that means is from Wave 1 all the way to the end of Wave 3, we might see some of these social issues change over time. Again, potentially getting at that last question, which is, do these change because of something that happens in the campaign and so on? So when we do a final, full, comprehensive report on all of this, we'll be able to share where we see the final outcome being. But I think that's the beauty of this year's study, is that it is an iterative process and we're bringing you into when we're collecting data and what's happening. The trend 5 that we originally reported on is something that we wanted to also note here, and that one being specifically around millennials still considering themselves activists, but without showing a strong affinity for direct action or supportive opposition to an issue. We noticed this potential trend in Wave 1, which was an interesting trend because when we look at this trend and when they see an individual sees themselves as an activist and where they turn to, we start to look at a potential new definition of cause engagement and cause activism. And even when you look at it from political ideology, it's interesting to note that there are some consistencies across different waves and across different people. Even though they're not the same, we still see some very interesting consistencies overall. And so from that perspective, I would say that we definitely find that the individual is participatory in smaller activism roles. We notice this, and you'll want to pay particular attention to both Wave 1 information around activism and Wave 2, but we're not seeing those higher levels of activism or support for causes that we have seen in other years that we've done the research, things like donations and volunteerism. What we would call a little bit more passive acts of activism than things like liking or petition signing, smaller pieces. This brings us to some additional questions, of course. How does the millennial actually define activism today? It's an interesting question that as researchers, we're starting to even think about the ways in which we ask that style of question. That question has been asked many years, for many years, not just by us, but by others. And even looking at how do we even change certain questions to reflect current culture. So for instance, some people would say, well, did you give to charity? And some might argue, well, I may have given, but I may not have given to a charitable organization. And so even asking a question that says, have you given to a nonprofit 501c3 organization is a different style of question than just saying, have you given to charity in general, because we have different forms today. The other thing is that when we look at some of the, somebody saying they somewhat consider them an activist, how do they believe change would occur, and where is their participatory role in it overall? And I think we've looked at that word activism and activist as a more stronger word on the continuum of involvement with causes and organizations. And we are actually seeing that it may not be that sort of strong definition necessarily that we've associated and aligned it to as we've seen throughout the years. So that's one thing that we're going to pay particular attention to. The next trend that we reported on in Wave 1 was trend 6, which is this is the update. Really, slightly fewer millennials believe people like them can make a difference in the United States and a better place to live, with the biggest drop seen among females. What's interesting is we look at when a person believes they can affect change, have an impact in what they do, we noticed that there were some changes both in the waves as well as where they saw themselves in sort of the moderate categories. Wave ones in female, as you see there on the screen, 39 to 32. And we also saw drops in both males as well, not as sharply as we saw with females. So this is the individual believing themselves as part of a solution to help create change. Something we talk a lot about in past millennial impact studies, where if messaging or other pieces helps the individual see themselves as a solution to helping the beneficiary, we would see higher response rates to, say, messaging and so forth. And we're worried, maybe essentially looking at this area, does this affect how the person believes themselves able to create change? So this brings up some clear questions as we go into the next wave, which is, why do females believe that they can have less of an impact than males? And then what other ways might millennials be actually creating change in the places where they live, work, and play that might not be our historic ways that we've measured it, of course? And then lastly, what are the characteristics in making the U.S. an important and a better place to live too? So we have to break down the words impact a little bit more. We need to also break down the understanding of the belief of making something better too as well. And that will be all done during the qualitative phase. The next trend that we reported on was around millennials' trust level. In the first one, we talked a little bit around the trust level, and really it's continued to have the same level of trust in government to do what is right, though the majority don't rate that trust as high. When we look at government trust levels overall, there is only 30. If you look at the categories 29, 25, and 3, we do see a majority in that lower categories trusting them only a little to not at all, and then don't know, and then preferring not to answer, of course. The trust level question has been asked in other research data points, and what we've noticed is that with this year's millennial cohorts, or millennial panels, participants in the research study, we see that some consistency in this line here around only trusting a little bit and lower. Brings us to some interesting questions too, which is around, has the election advanced to this gap in trust, when it comes to males and females? And of course, whether or not the candidate will encourage or increase or decrease that trust. And that's something that we can begin to ask in the qualitative measures, because that qualitative piece will be done post-election as well. The trend is by cause engagement by gender, and this is always one I like to share when we talk about females and males, because a lot of people are always wondering, where males and females have stands in different categories of cause engagement. So we looked at the cause engagement spectrum from the left on your screen there, which is volunteering, donating, supporting community projects. And I'm going to ask Dr. Amy Thayer to give us a little bit of information of what does it mean around supporting community projects?
Really just activities that are organized within your geographic community, within your community of association. So either geographically or social constructions of that.
Yeah. And then, of course, sign petitions and participating in demonstrations. What's interesting to note here is that we did see decreases in our different waves of people on the female side, fairly consistent in our male categories overall, but we did see declines in the female categories during this time. Remember, this wave was taken during June, July, and August of this year, of course. So this is something that we'll be monitoring over into the next wave, of course, and whether or not any of this cause engagement activity increased or decreased, especially during the times of the debates, and also during some media discussions around certain issues, social issues.
I actually think this trend, and I believe it was trend 5 previously, when you look at female, both whether or not they label themselves as activists or think that they can make a difference, sort of questionable there. And then also we see percentages going down here. So that'll be something, to your point, at the end of the election to really see, do females bounce back? Do they become more involved? Do they see themselves as being able to become more involved, or does it continue to decrease? But there's definitely, will be interesting to see what the correlations are there between these different findings.
The next one was that we break that cause engagement by political ideology. And as you'll notice here in this wave, those that volunteered, who have self-identified as volunteering donations, as well as community-supported projects, we see higher levels in the conservative side, same in around the signing of petitions area and category, and then participation in demonstrations. The neutral category, obviously, looking at those that identify within the middle, and or not at all. And when we look at this, it's important to note that this may or may not change over the course of the waves, given the discussions of what's going on. And we'll be looking at in the final report whether whether during certain times the different waves had different changes, of course. So this brought us to some interesting questions to consider. Is that, will they continue to decrease if projected voter turnout continues to decrease too? This cause engagement, this participation overall. And if you notice that in the data that we shared, these more passive forms of engagement, signing petitions, if we had to rank different cause engagement by how much they're doing, to more active engagement such as participating in demonstrations, volunteering, donating money, will we move from more passive to more active over the course of time? And then secondly, is this the new cause engagement area, where these new technology forms of activism, which may not have been similar forms such as participating in demonstrations, community projects, charitable, different types of activities, which might be considered entry points years ago, which are now we're looking at petition signing and other pieces more as the first levels and steps. So trend 9 is around social media engagement. The majority of millennials had actually posted about an issue in social media within the past week. If you look at the different platforms, Facebook continues to be higher ranked than all the others. And specifically when we're looking at social media engagement, males in particular were much higher than females in most categories, much higher, except in Facebook, it was fairly close. We also noticed the similar trend, obviously, when we looked at some other things in wave 1, too. But overall, I think it's something to note here that with the millennial populations that were part of the studies, Facebook continues to dominate. Twitter, we had less overall. Instagram, that's there. And when we look at Snapchat or others, although very big and popular, we didn't necessarily see social issue posting and self-identified either. Now, we'll look at the social media, whether it actually decreases over the course or increase. One of the things that, as we look around the debates or around some of the other data collection that we have right now in the last 2 months or so, some of that activity might spike even higher as we get closer and closer to the election. And are they using different forms differently? And that's something that we'll be beginning to ask in the qualitative function too. Trend 10, from June to August, support for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump by millennial respondents actually increased, with the largest shift going to Clinton. Of course, at that moment, we had Sanders was still in there, and then you can obviously see in August Sanders being at 0% if they had to vote for one of the candidates this year when we were pulling data from it. The Clinton from wave 1 with Clinton to wave 2, you can see starting out at 26 and then going all the way to 53 in August, with Sanders starting out at 28 and then getting down to 0. Of course, this is pulled from different participants over the time. You can see the differences in Trump as well. What's interesting to note is the not voting category, which is something that we're keeping an eye on, which I think a lot of people are too, is whether or not they're going to choose to vote. And then the none category also increased as well. So will millennials align with specific candidates as we get closer, and deciding not to vote or vote, of course? We'll know this in our post-election survey poll piece, and that survey will have information about how they voted and why. And we'll get some of that data back out actually that same week within this research study. Trend 11, the number of respondents planning to vote in the election actually decreased to its lowest point since we began the study. As we mentioned earlier, do you plan to vote? It had decreased to the lowest point, and we're going to be monitoring this in wave 3, whether or not that is actually getting worse or better. But we're a little concerned in that piece. And as we get closer, did millennial interest begin to lag because the election was happening is still a few months away, or was it just because of what was happening with the candidates? We need to know that. And why do more conservative-leaning millennials report that they're registered than liberal-leaning millennials as well? Something that we'll get into. And how will the percentages who are registered to vote translate into those who actually do vote? Which is why we're doing the post-survey piece too, right after the election. So what does this mean, and where do we go from here? And kind of the what's next situation. Well, we have been already capturing data during wave 3. Our wave 3 is September, October, and November. We'll be doing our post-November election survey piece that will debut there. And that post-election day survey will be available data that will be available within the week that we complete it. In addition to that, we're going to be doing our qualitative validation. This is where we go through the waves and select participants from those waves, perform qualitative interviews, getting at some of those questions. And of course, we're always open. This is the reason why we opened up to the public while the study was going on, so that you could see what we are getting, what we have our own questions. If you always would love to know something, or you have some instances where you would love to ask individuals who are part of this study why or why not they chose certain different pieces, feel free to send those to us. We're always open to considering and looking at that, how that is. After we finish the qualitative validation, what we'll do then is report a much more comprehensive report in the February to March timeframe. And in that comprehensive report, we will be discussing changes over the course of the year with the different candidates, cause engagement that had happened, and the final qualitative data that we gleaned from all of the individuals that were part of that phase. So that full report will be in February and March, and we'll of course have another one of these webinar sessions for individuals to hear from that qualitative data and what we learned overall from the study. So now we want to open it up to questions, of course. You can keep up with the trends, as I mentioned, at millennialimpact.com, but feel free to put in your questions right now, and we will make sure and get those to you. As you're entering in the questions, please, as you're going through the different questions, let us know if there's anything in specific data or questions that you may have just for the survey that we could go, or the qualitative part that we could have. So the question here, the first one is, how important is millennial religious views to this concern of social issues?
So that's not a topic actually that we broached in our survey, and so I appreciate that comment, because that is something that we could look at from other research to kind of bring in to inform the overall climate of the millennials, but it was not necessarily a focus of our study, but certainly you can't pull pieces and parts of people to understand if you don't look at the entire individual. And so, yeah, we can definitely look into that as we move forward.
Yeah, so any trend, the next question is around trends from social media. I think we shared those for, in particular, Instagram. Although Instagram was higher on the list, as mid category there, Facebook continued to be the highest piece that was used. And again, we'll continue to monitor that as we get closer and closer to the election too as well. And the other one is did you do any other surveys or comparisons to other generations? Yeah, this is something that we get a lot, this question around, tell me how this compares to boomers, or how does it compare to others? The Millennial Impact Project, when it was established, was just to look at the population of millennials and not look at comparative analysis. So we haven't actually done any comparatives in any of our studies for that general purpose. In addition to that, we find, as a note of our research sort of policies and standards, that it's difficult to do comparatives when there are social and cultural norms that challenge or change. from the time of, say, of when a boomer was 25 versus when now a millennial is. I'll give you one clear example. Boomers, necessarily, the debt scenario that we often hear about with millennials is partly attributable to changing culture in which that college is considered a gateway to go into debt, to go into college to then get a job, and so on. Historically, going into debt to go to college was not necessarily socially and culturally a positive thing that was communicated from parents down. So when we look at social and cultural norms, it's tough to keep those remaining constant across time. But we have not chosen to do any comparatives at this moment. The slides from the presentation will be sent afterwards, so no worries. We'll make sure and get you that in addition to the recording too as well. And the next question is, I think we have some PowerPoint available questions, sorry. This next question is, could the trend of lower engagement in the summer months be tied to the fact that college students are away from school in the summer and thus less likely to have access to organized causes and service projects? It could. I mean, those are factors that we'll need to ask. It's a good question to ask during the qualitative pieces. But we do know that cause engagement continues to be over the course of the year. And there's several different styles of cause engagement that we noticed, both not only in our studies, but in others. Is that first, we know that millennials and other individuals participate in causes impulsively and at times emotionally and empathetically. And then there are times that they move up a spectrum of more thoughtful behavior with, say, service projects or where there's high expectations. And so what we haven't necessarily seen is a decrease over the summer months and at any point in our studies over the course of the years, but rather they're just active and engaged over time specifically. But that's something that we can definitely look into. Do you think the trends around ability to make an impact are generational or life stage related? Is it just reality setting in as they mature? Interesting note on that. So a couple things to think about. When we look at millennial studies in general, we do know that there are life cycle trends, right? There are several of them. One is when the person is completely and utterly financially dependent on themselves, are independent. I'm sorry. When they have no tie, not even healthcare costs or anything to their parents or anybody else. The second one being is that when they have their first dependent, which that they're financially then supporting somebody else too. And then lastly is when we see advancement start to happen in career and professional. And so that is the case. I think what's most interesting to note is that we still are seeing even across that time span of those that were in their 20s to lower 30s, this impact piece, even though we have life cycle changes happening in there. The aggregate of it all is very interesting. It still speaks to that level where the individual doesn't believe in that impact stage. But that's something worth monitoring as we go forward. Does the qualitative piece of the study seek to understand how millennials conceptualize and operationalize activism and create change? Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what we want to do. We've been you kind of got onto something here, Cody, in your question that we've been asking ourselves for the last 2 years, which is how do we define millennial cause engagement today? What does it mean? And where are we going forward with it? And we've been doing we do a lot of qualitative here, whether it's a running study to the alumni studies or all others. And this study in particular, it's really important because we believe we might be on the verge of a new definition of cause engagement. And how we conceptualize and operationalize activism is something that we think we need to help the field understand. And we think that this, in addition to next year's research around social issues and activism, is something that will get a lot into those particular categories. So that's something that we'll be monitoring in.
And I was just going to say, similarly, we're also going to delve into how they define conservative leaning and liberal leaning, so that we have an understanding: are they fiscally conservative, are they socially conservative? And so that may help lend insight into the activism piece as well. How do they spend their time and why?
Yeah. The next question is: there seems to be a distinct value for neutrality as opposed to an abdication of responsibility. Is this being considered or investigated, Dr. Thayer?
I think definitely in the qualitative that would be really interesting to find out, because as we know from the general population during this election season, it is really interesting to see if folks are truly neutral or they're just apathetic and have given up because they don't like either side. And so I think during the qualitative phase, that is really, in all honesty, going to pull this entire study together, I think, because right now we understand the what and how they're responding, but we don't really know why. And so these are great questions. And so, as Derek said, as we move along and you're able to bring in questions for us to investigate, I think this gives us some things to further consider as we move along.
The next question is around what does the political identity breakdown look like in relation to government trust overall? I think we can actually pull that data. We don't have it right now readily available, but that would be something that we could share with you. But thank you for the question. But yeah, there is some potential correlation.
Absolutely, and I think post-election that will be even more interesting to see, depending on who has won the election.
Yeah, exactly. Did you ask if they had children, and if so, did they make a difference on preference of top issue? We didn't ask dependent. There were income-related demographic questions as well. Yeah, and marriage too. The other thing is your results seem to conflict with other research we've been reviewing, such as Pew Research Center. Can you help us understand why your results might be diverging? Interesting, because as we look at, we've had a chance actually to compare a lot with both Pew and a couple other bigger studies that are out there, and we see a lot of alignment. Our study is primarily focused on activism and cause engagement with politics. And so those studies are not necessarily focused on those categorical areas. To do comparatives is very tough from that. We have actually noticed, we even looked at Harvard's recent release of their pieces, and we noticed very, very similar findings that they're finding too. And we'll likely, if you'd like to email us, we can send you that study as well, because they're looking at social issue behavior.
In addition, I think it's important to say these are trends that are emerging. It's not one point in time data collection that we're looking at. We're looking across months and across trends, and across waves, which help us develop trends. And so some of those studies do polls at a specific point in time. And so our data may actually match more closely than we even know if we deconstructed it that way.
Yeah. The next question is do you think the passive form of cause support and engagement is a long-term trend or something we're just seeing during this election season? I think that this kind of goes to the new cause engagement definition, both of activism and the way that we engage with social issues. I think that organizations have expected different things than necessarily what populations have actually garnered in certain areas. I do think that this is something that has a very big long-term potential. I think that we're finally into a new era of activism today where the tenets are the same, but the function and form and the transactional behavior to fulfill activism is what's changing. And grassroots organizing remains, the idea of that remains kind of constant. But what is also happening in that constant is new forms of activism in which that you can express yourself are being developed in real time. That changes the way in which that we do things. The other thing is that we have to, and I kind of wrote about this in the book I wrote, Social Movements for Good, which is around the behavior of the mind. I mean, the mind is the path of least resistance model, right? Always doing, it's like, how do I get the lowest or highest return for the lowest energy kind of piece? And when we see that, we see these levels of activism being a way for them to stand up and not necessarily volunteer for X amount of hours and so on. So I think that we have new ladders of engagement that organizations need to clearly define. I think this study is going to be the start of that, and next year's study will also define that even deeper. The next one is, I'm sorry if I missed this, but what is the actual age range of the millennials in the studies? So
we broke it down from, I'm trying to think for this wave, I apologize because we have several different people.
I believe we are in, from the 21 to 32, 35, 33 category is where we are. And those were broken down by also age brackets, if I'm correct.
Age brackets and also gender, which is in a previous slide. It's in the beginning.
Yeah, and we have those broken down in a previous, and this goes to the next question. If you look deeper into age brackets, absolutely. We did not go to, this question is around, did you look at 18 to 21-year-olds? We did not go down to 18. We did go down to, oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we did go down to 18. and to 24. And then from there, we went from 25 to 30 and 31 to 36. The next one is, do you ever look at millennials outside the US for comparisons? There have been, we have not yet, but the body of knowledge that we do have and body of research since 2009, we have had a lot of different sort of areas of the world that have wanted to do comparisons. We have not. There's obviously a cultural screening piece that needs to be done on how we talk about causes and social issue piece as well. So that's something that we'll be addressing too if we were, but we don't. We did get some in past years, have some data in Canada and North America, but have not actually reported it. The other thing is that since this year is primarily focused on the US election, we screened only for those within the United States. And we look at the same data, yes, I think this is similar to the other previous question, which is around data. We have other questions around presentations and recordings. Yes, we will send out the full recording of this and the questions in addition to the presentation and also the report if you have not downloaded it. I take it most of you have, which is at millennialimpact.com, and those will be all available for you.
And as we move along each wave, we are presenting the demographics of each wave, so you can see the differences in age breakdowns within the millennial generation as we move along.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that nears the end of our time together. We thank you for joining us today as we went through this session. If you do have any additional questions or would like to provide any insight into the qualitative portions as we move into that section, like these questions that you had here where we said those are good things to know, we took notes on those. I think the best part of this study is that it's over time, as Amy said, and we opened it up for you to see. We opened the hood while we were going through this, and I think that's an incredible opportunity. We're not seeing a lot of other studies doing that. And as we also look at this, we'll look forward to sending you more updates along the way. And we'll be featuring more articles about what we found this year and how that may or may not change the definition of cause engagement. Thank you again for all of your time. We really appreciate your interest and your participation, and we'll look forward to the next time that we'll share our data together. Bye-bye.